There are files no one dares to open. Names buried under layers of dust, sealed in leather-bound books that no institution will admit to owning. And inside those pages, there are stories that were never meant to be told. This is one of them. The year was 1865. The war had ended, but something darker had begun. In a remote village of Daggermoor, where fog clings to stone walls like a second skin and the church bells echo long after midnight, a case emerged so disturbing, so unnatural, that the physicians who witnessed it either fled the profession or went mad trying to understand it. Her name was Maribelle. No surname, no birthplace, no known family. She was delivered under armed escort to the Eastwell Sanatorium for the mentally afflicted, a place already whispered about in hushed tones across Lancashire. The order came directly from the Archbishop's office, bypassing local law, bypassing medical boards. Even the guards who delivered her refused to speak of what they saw. All they would say was, she should not be here. She should not be anywhere. Within 72 hours of her arrival, 3 nurses resigned. One was found in the chapel, sobbing uncontrollably, convinced she had been cursed by merely meeting Maribelle's gaze. Patients in neighboring wards began to scream at night, not in pain, but in languages they did not know. One man, deaf since birth, began reciting Latin scripture in his sleep. Maribelle said nothing. She didn't need to. And you, watching this, you feel it already, don't you? This is not just a story. This is a descent. But I warn you, once you hear what happened inside those walls, there is no going back. What the doctors discovered, and tried desperately to erase, reveals something far more terrifying than possession, madness, or disease. It reveals a design, ancient, buried deep in religious systems and scientific halls alike, a design meant to control you. Welcome to Dead Scroll. If you're still here, you're not like the others. Subscribe now, not for entertainment, but for survival. And if this story starts to feel too close to the truth, don't look away. The Eastwell Sanatorium stood at the edge of a blackened moor, isolated, silent, and surrounded by a rusted iron fence that always seemed to hum with a faint current, like it had a pulse of its own. Built in 1812 by the Royal Society of Psychological Advancement, Eastwell was a place where science claimed dominion over the soul. Its motto etched in Latin over the main gate: in ration, salus, in reason, salvation. But salvation was the one thing Eastwell never delivered. The interior was a monument to order: stone floors, wrought iron beds, corridors lit by gas lamps that flickered unnaturally when Maribelle passed. The staff followed a strict protocol: observation, documentation, isolation, designed not for healing, but containment. She arrived on the cold morning of November 3rd, eyes downcast, barefoot, her wrists shackled and blackened iron despite her calm demeanor. In her silence, it was unnatural. Not the silence of trauma, not fear. It was the silence of knowing. She stared at the walls like they were speaking to her, or waiting. Dr. Lionel Verrick, the facility's chief examiner, had treated war veterans shattered by cannon fire and aristocrats crushed by syphilitic delusions. But he would later write, "The girl radiated something that does not belong to the human condition." Her presence was not absence of reason. It was reason corrupted, like logic infected by something older. Upon intake, she refused to give any name beyond Maribelle. Age? Unclear. Some thought she looked 17. Others swore she was well into her 30s. Her skin was pale, like paper soaked in moonlight. Her heartbeat, irregular. Her temperature? Room temperature. No fever, no cold. Her body betrayed no signs of life, yet she was alive. They assigned her to the South Wing. A mistake. Within hours, order began to unravel. One nurse collapsed in the hallway after entering her room. Her final words: "Her eyes are hollow. Something lives behind them." That nurse never returned. Another claimed Maribelle whispered to her through the walls, not in English, but in a rhythmic, pulsing tongue that made her ears bleed. Dr. Verrick ordered her sedated, but the serum wouldn't hold. Not because it wore off, but because her blood rejected it. He recorded his findings that night. Just 6 words, scrawled violently into his ledger. "She is not one of us." For centuries, men have built institutions to contain what they do not understand. Eastwell was one of them, a place designed to sanitize the unexplained with procedure and protocol. But Maribelle wasn't a patient. She was a crack in the system, a living contradiction the institution had no language for. And the deeper they probed, the more unstable Eastwell became. Within 3 days of her arrival, the ward cats began to disappear. Then the birds. Not a single crow remained on the moor's bare trees. The sky above the south wing lost its flock. Dr. Vurick, disturbed but still grasping for logic, ordered Maribelle's room stripped of all objects, even the mattress, to isolate stimuli. But she didn't protest. She simply sat in the far corner of the room, hands folded, head slightly tilted, like she was listening to something just beneath the surface of sound. Nurse Eleanor Bragg, a devout Anglican and former missionary, believed Maribelle was speaking to something not visible to the rest of them. She documented an event that remains one of the most chilling pieces of the record. At 3:16 a.m., the door to Maribelle's room was found wide open. Not broken, not unlocked, just open. Inside, Maribelle was standing, not moving, not speaking, but around her every candle that had been extinguished for the night had relit, without flame. When Nurse Bragg approached, she heard what she described as a choir of voices, but none of them human. She collapsed moments later, nose bleeding, hands trembling. Her final written note before she was transferred to a hospital in York read, "It speaks through her, and it's older than God." Dr. Vurick requested assistance from the Royal College of Medicine, but the response was delayed. Something about internal restructuring and lack of jurisdiction over ecclesiastically protected cases. Bureaucratic nonsense. But in truth, it wasn't bureaucracy. It was fear. Eastwell had become a place no one wanted to acknowledge. A place tainted by a girl who shouldn't exist. And you, still listening, feel that tension now, don't you? That sensation crawling just beneath your skin. The part of you that recognizes this isn't just history, it's a warning. The kind men in power don't want heard. So if you're still with me, like this video now, spread it before they pull it down. This story isn't safe. And we haven't even reached the breaking point. They tried to isolate the anomaly. But what do you do when the anomaly becomes the heir? After Maribelle's fourth night, something began to change in the building itself. Eastwell's architecture, brick, limestone, and old timber, had always grown with age. But now the sounds were different. Not structural, not environmental. The nurses began calling it the whispering. A low murmuring drifted through the south wing. No source, no language, just an audible pressure that set teeth on edge and made mirrors hum. Dr. Vurick ordered a full inspection of the heating system, assuming faulty pipes were to blame. The engineers found nothing, but they refused to return. One of them wrote a single word in chalk on the boiler room wall before quitting the next morning. Alive. Meanwhile, Maribelle had stopped eating. No food, no water. 5 days. And yet, no weight loss. No dehydration. Her muscles remained taut. Her pulse, still irregular, was now syncing with the flickering of the gas lamps. A pattern, almost musical. Dr. Vurick documented this change, but his hands shook while writing. That night, his journal entry ended mid-sentence. That same evening, a Catholic priest named Father Renaud Thorne arrived at Eastwell uninvited. He claimed to have been sent by those who monitor the old bloodlines. His robes were scorched. His hands were burned. And he insisted on seeing Maribelle alone. Dr. Vurick refused. But it wasn't enough. At precisely 2:44 a.m., the bells of St. Bridget's Chapel, 3 miles away, began ringing on their own. Not a storm. No wind. Just the deafening clang of a bell tower that had stood silent since 1849. Witnesses claimed the sound caused patients in the northern ward to convulse. Several had nosebleeds. One tore out his own eyes. Maribelle remained seated, unmoving, eyes open, watching the wall. And here's what no one can explain. Eastwell's clocks all stopped at 2:44 that morning. Every single one. The time Maribelle was born, according to the only document ever found with her name. Let that sink in. This isn't folklore. This is a record of pattern phenomena. Ancient triggers hidden in time, ritual, and blood. And Maribelle was activating them. Still watching? Then you're the kind of man who doesn't look away when the veil lifts. The kind they can't put back to sleep. By the 6th day, Eastwell was a fortress without logic. Every law the doctors knew, biology, psychology, physics, bent in the presence of that girl. But they couldn't admit it. To do so would collapse the very foundation their world was built on. And still, she said nothing. Not a word. It was the silence that broke them. Not hysteria. Not violence. But that inhuman quiet that wrapped around the staff like cold water. On the seventh day, something else shifted. Dr. Verrick, known for his rationalism and disregard for spiritual nonsense, walked into Maribelle's room at 6 a.m. alone. By 6:07, he came out weeping, sobbing like a child. He was found an hour later in the Eastwell archives, tearing out pages from religious texts, Latin, Greek, even Aramaic, muttering the same phrase over and over. She remembers what we buried. When questioned, he had no memory of the visit. Later that night, orderlies claimed to see shapes moving across the ceiling of the south wing. Not shadows. Shapes. Limbs too long, heads too narrow. They crawled across the walls like insects, silent and inverted. When a young patient pointed at them and screamed, he was dragged into a seizure and lost the ability to speak. Maribelle never blinked. She simply looked at the door. On day 8, the walls of Eastwell began to bleed. At first, the staff believed it to be rust or damp rot. But chemical analysis confirmed otherwise. Type AB-negative blood, consistent with a healthy adult female. The same type found in Maribelle's veins. Except, not quite. Her cells contained anomalies never recorded in medical science. Proteins with spiral structures. Blood that resisted clotting. A faint bioluminescence when placed under moonlight. And then came the screaming. Not from Maribelle. From the walls. 2 nurses fled Eastwell before midnight, convinced the building was alive. One would later be institutionalized herself, whispering the phrase, "She isn't the patient. She's the purpose." You still think this is exaggeration? You think this is just an old case from the past? Then explain this. In 1974, during renovations, workers uncovered a sealed chamber beneath Maribelle's room. Inside, human teeth. Hundreds of them, arranged in a spiral. Still wet. This story isn't ancient. It's active. If you're still watching, type the phrase, "She's the purpose," in the comments. Let the world know the veil is cracking, that there's a rule the old priests knew. One not written in scripture, but carved into the walls of underground chapels. Never name what you don't understand. But someone did. On the 9th night, a nurse named Lisbeth Ray, newly transferred and unfamiliar with the warnings, entered Maribelle's room alone and called her by a name that was never part of the records. A name that appears nowhere else in Eastwell's files. She whispered, "Anathema." That was all it took. The moment the word left her lips, every light in Eastwell died. Not flickered, not dimmed. They died. Gas lines ceased to hiss. Lanterns refused to ignite. Even matches wouldn't spark. What followed was a silence, so total that the staff claimed to hear their own heart stop for a beat. Then the sound returned. But it didn't come from outside the building. It came from underneath. Stone grinding against stone. Like something vast was shifting below the foundation. Like something that had been waiting. When light finally returned, hours later, Nurse Lisbeth was gone. Her shift partner, Nurse Harrow, found the room empty save for a message carved deep into the floorboards. The name is a door. Dr. Verrick, now unraveling by the hour, ordered every member of staff to avoid all contact with Maribelle. But it was already too late. Something had been triggered, a sequence no one could stop. The patients in the upper wing began chanting at night. Words that didn't match any language, yet were spoken in unison. They stood in their rooms, eyes rolled back, arms stretched in cruciform position. When restrained, they vomited teeth. Human teeth. Not their own. What had been a singular case had become a plague of cognition. A contagion of belief. Father Thorne, the burned priest, returned 2 nights later. He'd gone to the Chapel of Hollow Saints, a forbidden site sealed since the plague years, and returned with a book wrapped in cloth stitched with hair. He called it the wound of God. When asked what was inside, he said, "Not knowledge, not prophecy, just a mirror." For her. You understand what this means, don't you? Maribelle wasn't infected. She was the infection. Still with me? Then subscribe now, because they've tried to bury this story before. And next, we enter the chamber. You remember the chamber beneath Maribelle's room? Let's go there now. They weren't supposed to open it. The builders in 1974 said the spiral of teeth was enough, a clear sign to seal it again and walk away. But curiosity, pride, and fear make a dangerous mixture. So they pried it open. Behind the spiral lay a staircase. 15 steps, each carved from bone-white stone, descending into what should have been bedrock. Instead, they found a space, not vast, but endless in feeling. A single chamber shaped like a perfect circle, exactly 21 feet across. The walls were smooth. No seams, no tool marks, just a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Workers' flashlights dimmed as they entered, as though drained by the air itself. And in the center, a chair. Not wood, not iron, something in between, something grown. Sitting in that chair was a figure, human in shape, but every inch covered in tight black linen, stitched shut at the eyes, the mouth, even the fingers. Bound in place with cords made of woven hair, some of it fresh, some ancient. The figure didn't move, but it breathed, and next to the chair, a name carved into the floor. Maribelle. This was 109 years after she vanished. And the body in that chair? Still warm. Tests failed. The figure disintegrated on contact with metal. Any digital equipment used in the chamber shorted immediately. Film turned to ash. But one photo remains, an old Polaroid taken by a contractor on a dare. It's grainy, almost blurred beyond meaning. But if you stare long enough, you'll see her eyes. Not shut, not sewn, open. That photo is now classified, held in a sealed archive beneath a university lab in Massachusetts. But whispers of it still travel. They say if you stare too long, you start to hear her. Not speaking, thinking. And once you hear her, you start dreaming about the chair. If you're still watching, like the video now, not just for the story, but to keep it breathing. To keep her breathing. Because the deeper we go, the less this becomes history, and the more it becomes invitation. After the chamber was discovered, the state ordered Eastwell closed. They called it a safety hazard, blamed unstable foundations, and classified all findings under the Antiquities Preservation Act. But the truth was far more desperate. Eastwell hadn't become unsafe, it had become uncontainable. And Maribelle? She was no longer listed as a patient. In fact, by 1866, her entire file had vanished. Not just removed, erased. Paper records, ink logs, witness accounts. Even the census that once named her parents now held only blank spaces. No birth certificate, no death, no grave, as if she had never existed. Except one detail survived. A single torn page from Dr. Varick's journal. Found tucked inside the Chapel of Hollow Saints, under a stone carved with the Latin phrase, in tenebris inventa, found in darkness. The page read, Maribelle is not a name. She is a location. A point in time where reality folds. A gate disguised as flesh. When the Vatican's secret order, the custodians of the fold, caught wind of this, they dispatched 3 black-robed envoys. Men trained in silence, forbidden from writing or speaking once a case begins. They stayed at Eastwell for 72 hours. All left blind. Every one of them. One carved a message into his own chest before vanishing into the woods. She showed me the true womb. And now I am unborn. No priest returned after that. No doctor dared re-enter. Eastwell was shuttered. Maribelle's room, room 14, was bricked shut from the inside, and a 7-layer seal of ash, lime, salt, bone dust, and pig's blood was applied across its threshold. Local legend says the walls behind it still pulse at night. That children walking past Eastwell go silent. Not by choice, but by force. And then came the letters. Unmarked, unaddressed, handwritten on vellum, sealed in wax. Each said the same thing. Do not remember her. She is not a story. She is a summons. And now here you are, remembering her. If this story is shaking something in you, then comment the word unborn below. Help the others find it. Subscribe to Dead Scroll, because this is just the surface. There's a phrase scratched into the sub-basement wall of Eastwell, written backward, as if meant only to be read through a mirror. It says, she didn't die. She was translated. Let that settle. Because what happened in 1865 wasn't a death. It was a conversion. On the night the chamber opened, every clock in Eastwell stopped at 2:17 a.m. Gas lanterns burst. Nurses reported the temperature dropped below freezing, but only inside Maribelle's wing. Patients wept blood. One nurse, Marion Kelvey, wrote in her final note, "I heard a voice from under the floor. It knew my name before I was born." And then the power went out. No one knows exactly how long the blackout lasted. Some said a minute. Others claimed they wandered the halls for hours, but the sun never rose. It was as if time folded inward, the asylum frozen in a breathless second. And in that second, room 14 split open. Not exploded, not shattered. Split like skin under pressure. Survivors described the sound not as destruction, but as birth. The walls peeled back. Not brick, not wood, but something beneath, soft, veined and pulsing. Maribelle was no longer in the chair. She was standing, naked, eyes open, and smiling. But the smile wasn't hers, because her face wasn't hers. It was a collage of everyone who had ever seen her. A shifting, writhing mask of recognition, like your own reflection nodding from inside the glass before you do. One orderly tried to run. He made it to the threshold before he collapsed. Mouth full of insects, hair turned white. The insects had words on their wings. Latin. One spelled out, Mater Void, Mother of the Void. The figure that stood in room 14 was a Maribelle. It was the absence of her. An echo made flesh. And then it spoke. Not aloud, but into the minds of everyone present. A single sentence repeated like a mantra. I am the womb beneath the womb. What followed was recorded on one surviving audio cylinder, now housed at a private institute in Vienna. They don't play it. They can't. Because every time they try, the needle snaps and the windows crack. Section 11 is next. Subscribe now. Because Maribelle is no longer just a girl. She is a gate. And it just opened. The cylinder that survived the breach, the one in Vienna, was catalogued under the title Vox Nullum, the voice of nothing. Its recording time is listed as midnight, even though it contains 11 distinct audio events. Scholars say that's impossible, an auditory object with no length that still speaks. But that's what translation means in this case. Maribelle wasn't transformed, she was repurposed. An instrument, a channel, and what came through her has no name in any known theology. One sound from a cylinder, a deep, metallic heartbeat, was analyzed by frequency technicians in 1928. They claimed it didn't follow the rules of rhythmic physics. Instead of rising and falling, it folded. They described it as a circular beat, like time collapsing in on itself. A loop with no origin. More disturbing were the whispers, barely audible beneath the main signal. When reversed, slowed, and cleaned, the technicians could isolate 7 distinct voices, all speaking in unison, all saying the same thing. She is dreaming you. Not, you are dreaming of her. She is dreaming you. Reality itself, imagined by a girl that no longer exists. Or worse, a girl that was never born, but awakened. At this point, Daggermoor had begun to change. Livestock stopped birthing live young. Rain fell in patterns that formed symbols in the dirt. Children were born with extra ribs. Some had eyes that reflected no light. People who lived near the asylum heard lullabies at night, not sung but hummed. Always the same tune. A melody that, when transcribed to sheet music, spells out the sigil found on the Eastwell chamber door. A spiral with a slit, like an eye, or a wound. The Vatican sent 2 last observers to the town in 1867. Both were burned beyond recognition in their beds. Yet neither bed had a fire, and no source of heat was found. But the walls had ash prints. Tiny hands, child-sized, and all facing inward, toward the center of the house, toward where Maribelle's name had been scratched in reverse into the wood. We're only now entering the core of what she became. So hit like, subscribe to Dead Scroll, and do not look away. They called it the Dream Room. It was never meant to exist. Beneath Eastwell Asylum's foundations, past the Forbidden Wing and the blood-sealed Iron Gate, was a room no architect could account for. There were no blueprints, no mention of it in the original plans. And yet, every survivor of the 1865 incident described the same place. A circular chamber. No windows, no door, no visible source of light. And yet it was lit, dimly, as if by memory. The walls were lined with etchings, not carved but grown. Fleshy patterns, like scar tissue formed into sacred geometry. Glyphs in a language that moved when not watched. Every surface whispered, not with voices but with thoughts, dreams. And at the center of the room, on a slab of black stone, lay Maribelle. But it wasn't her body. It was a likeness, crafted entirely from blood, hair, teeth, and a substance later identified as partially calcified spinal fluid. It pulsed with heat. It breathed. And if you stared long enough, it blinked. One nurse, Eleanor Fay, stood too close. She described hearing music, not with her ears, but inside her spine. Her last written words were, "She's still dreaming, but the dream has become aware." She tore out her tongue with her hands. The thing on the slab is believed to be a neural anchor, a biological knot, tethering whatever came through Maribelle to our world. Destroying it proved impossible. Every attempt, fire, acid, gunpowder, even holy relics, failed. The substance regenerated within minutes. One priest attempted exorcism. He burst into flame before he spoke the first word. What made it worse? Every time the anchor was damaged, Daggermoor suffered. Farms curdled. Wells turned black. Children wept until their eyes bled. Entire nights went missing. People would blink, and it would be dawn with no memory of sleep. Time slipped, and in their dreams, they saw her, Maribelle, standing in the dream room, mouth sewn shut, but eyes wide open, watching, waiting, and whispering directly into their thoughts. "Don't wake me. You won't survive me awake. This is not over. This is not even the middle." Hit like, subscribe to Dead Scroll, in the comments, right? I saw her eyes. So we know who she's already touched. Daggermoor's town archives were once held in the old church basement. St. Helena's, a long-abandoned chapel now, fenced off by rusted iron and overgrowth. Officially condemned, unofficially guarded. The archives were never digitized. Everything is paper, wax-sealed, or worse, transcribed in ink made from crushed bones and dried placenta, a practice outlawed in 1812 but quietly continued in places where time refused to move forward. The ledger that mattered most was bound in human skin. Its title was simple. 4. No author. No date. No page numbers. But each page held a record of visions. Not dreams. Not hallucinations. Visions that came to townspeople after contact with the marked girls. A farmhand described watching a clock bleed. A child said the birds began chanting in Latin. A midwife saw her own unborn twin crawl out her shadow. But the most chilling entry came from a man named Emery Vale, recorded in 1833, the year the third girl disappeared. He wrote, "She was standing at the edge of my property, not moving. Her mouth was stitched. But I heard her in my head, over and over. Tell them not to name me. I'm only sleeping. Don't wake the mother." What Emery didn't know, what none of them knew, was that his property sat directly on top of the buried structure, now known as the Eastwell Spiral. A subterranean ruin, circular, unmapped, and humming. When researchers entered it in 1897, they lasted 7 minutes before vomiting blood. One of them clawed his own eyes out and whispered, "Too late. She's already looking through us." Here's where things bend reality. A woman named Evelyn Harrow, librarian of Daggermoor in 1904, wrote a sealed letter to the future. It was addressed to whoever uncovered the 4 ledger. It read, "Do not let them burn the records. Every 4th girl is a vessel, but every 5th is a doorway." We believe Maribelle was the 4th, but recent discoveries point to something worse. There was another girl, born in Daggermoor in 1875. Her name? Sarah Vale, Emery Vale's granddaughter, and she vanished on her 11th birthday. In the same month, Maribelle's anchor began to pulse again. This is not a haunting. This is not a possession. This is a timeline breaking open. So like this video. Subscribe to Dead Scroll if you haven't already. And brace yourself. No one knows who coined the phrase the veil. Some say it's an old Romani term for the boundary between waking and dream. Others claim it originated in a lost manuscript from the Black Abbey, where monks believe the world we see is merely the skin of a deeper one. A thin, pulsing membrane separating us from something more ancient and more aware. And in 1883, that membrane began to tear. It started with a clock tower in Daggermoor that chimed 13 times at midnight, even though it had no chime mechanism. The priest who lived next to it was found kneeling in his bed, whispering, "She's climbing through the stitch. Hide the name. Burn the books." Then came the mouths. 7 infants born across the region, each with no eyes, but with small, perfect mouths on their palms. None of them cried, but if you held them close, you'd hear whispering. One nurse described it as a voice from behind fabric. When the children were taken to the asylum, Maribelle reacted violently. For the first time in 12 years, she stood upright. No assistance. No expression. She faced the wall and began scratching. Not with her nails, which had been cut. Not with her teeth, which had long since decayed. But with a black shard that no one saw her possess. A splinter of something harder than bone, sharper than glass. By the time the nurses restrained her, she'd carved a single sentence. "The veil is skin, and mother is teeth." She did not speak again. But that same night, lightning struck the asylum's west wing, a place that had not housed patients for over a decade. In the ash was found a cradle, made of bone and thorns, untouched by fire. Inside it, a spiral of hair, long black, still growing. Researchers believe it belonged to Sarah Vale, or what remained of her, because hair is memory, and this memory was still alive. Witnesses say the cradle emitted a sound, not audible but felt, like something ancient breathing through the bones of the building. One nun collapsed on the spot, another went blind, but both described the same vision. A tower of flesh with a mouth at the top, and a lullaby leaking from its lips. Subscribe to Dead Scroll if your mind is still yours. Her name was never written down. Not in books, not in birth ledgers, not even whispered in confessions. But those who lived in Daggermoor before the founding of the asylum spoke of her in symbols. A twisted braid of black wool hung from a tree branch. A cracked mirror buried beneath salt. A doll left at the foot of a grave with sewn eyes and no hands. She was known only as the midwife. But she did not deliver children. She harvested them. The midwife was not seen. She was felt. Her presence warped the air. Animals refused to walk where she'd stood. Flowers bent away from her shadow. And those who accidentally stepped into her path were marked. Not physically, but in dreams. They'd see a lantern flickering in a sea of black. A voice behind them, calm, slow, and wet. A single sentence. "You were meant for elsewhere." It is believed that she created the cradle discovered in the West Wing. Not as a resting place, but as a beacon. A nest to signal something larger. Something older than any name. The midwife's origin traces back to 1639, during the Night of Hollow Births, when 11 mothers across the valley delivered children without organs, bones, or blood. Yet the infant smiled. Smiled without mouths. Every one of those mothers later vanished. And their husbands were found hanging upside down from the church rafters, their mouths stuffed with salt. At the center of the church, a blood sigil. A spiral with 13 points. The same spiral found in Maribelle's cell. The same one scratched on the inside of the asylum's coffins, even those buried before she was born. Researchers today speculate the midwife is not a person, but a ritual, a process, a bridge given form. She appears when the veil is weakest and carries seeds to plant into the world. Maribelle was one of those seeds. Sarah Vale was the second, and there are 11 others. Not names, not people, just vessels, and their dreams all in the same way. A cold hand on their chest and a whisper. "Wake up, my child. You were born in the wrong world." Like this video, subscribe to Dead Scroll, and in the comments, type, "The midwife walks." The first of the vessels to return was named Elsa Bramwin, but that was not the name she was born with. She appeared in Daggermoor in 1891, barefoot, wrapped in a red burial shroud, carrying a candle made of human tallow. Her eyes were white, pupils gone, yet she navigated the crooked forest paths with precision, as if she remembered them from before she existed. A farmer's wife spotted her kneeling at the dry riverbed behind the asylum. The same river Maribelle was found walking across in her sleep decades earlier. Elsa wasn't praying. She was whispering into the soil. The wife claimed the ground beneath Elsa began to quiver, like something was listening. Within hours, the animals on 3 farms were dead, not torn or rotted, but folded, as if crushed from the inside by invisible hands. No blood, no wounds, just bent forms and a trail of fine black powder leading back to the river. That powder tested positive for bone ash. Elsa Bramwin never spoke to a single soul, but she was seen writing in soot across stone, glass, and barn walls. Always the same message. Open the gate beneath the skin. When officials approached her, she simply turned and bled from the eyes, the ears, and the fingernails. The doctor who examined her died in his sleep 2 nights later, with a smile carved into his throat and soot under his tongue. Elsa was taken to the asylum, and when Maribelle saw her, she stood up, walked across the room, and knelt before her. Every clock in the asylum stopped. Maribelle whispered something that has never been translated. A single sentence in a language not found in any known lexicon, but which every nurse described as beautiful and terrifying. The lights exploded. The west hallway buckled. And then, silence. When orderlies returned, Elsa was gone. Only Maribelle remained, grinning, and missing every tooth. The room smelled of candle wax and seawater. And on the wall, freshly carved, "The mother has eaten one. 11 remain." Like, comment, open the gate beneath the skin. The next vessel didn't walk. He crawled, backwards, out of a well that had been dry for 40 years. It was 1893 when the townsfolk of Daggermoor began reporting a sound beneath the stone, like whispers echoing inside a glass throat. At first, they blamed the wind. But the wind doesn't beg. It doesn't repeat your name in reverse. The well had been sealed since 1851, after the death of Sarah Vale. But on a cold morning in February, a child was found slumped beside it, face down, pale, shivering. No one recognized him. He had no shoes, no teeth, and no tongue. But still he spoke, not from his mouth, from his shadow. Witnesses claimed the shape he cast on the ground moved separately from his body. It formed symbols, stretched long and thin like a broken marionette, and it spoke in riddles in a rasping, wet voice. The first words were, "Father is hollow. He is coming to fill the rest." They took the boy to the asylum. Maribelle laughed when she saw him. Not the way humans laugh, but the way a fire crackles when it touches bone. She leaned in and whispered a single word, "Darien." Staff checked every record. There was no Darien, not in Daggermoor, not in any parish or census. But in Maribelle's personal file, in a page-long thought lost, a line was scribbled in blood. "If Darien returns, bury me under the river." That night, she tried to claw her own eyes out, not out of fear, but to see differently, to greet him the old way, she said. Because Darien was not human. He was a mouth, a channel. Every mirror in the asylum cracked. Patients began drawing spirals with their own hair. One woman birthed a rat. Another screamed that the floor was bleeding. Darien was kept in cell 13 until he disappeared. No doors were opened. No windows broken. Just an oily trail leading back toward the well. And carved into the wall? He was only the tongue. The throat comes next. Like this episode if your skin is still yours. Subscribe to Dead Scroll before the throat opens. There were only 2 people who ever claimed to have seen the full map stitched into Maribelle's mother's burial dress. Both men were gravekeepers, and both are dead. One drowned in a bucket. The other clawed out his own eyes and begged to be buried without a name. But before their deaths, they managed to describe parts of the map to a local priest, Father Auric Falk, a man who, until then, had dismissed Maribelle's case as folklore, superstition, or hysteria. But the symbols they drew from memory matched those hidden on the altar of the asylum chapel. Symbols older than scripture, older than ink. One glyph appeared 13 times. A symbol of a child suspended upside down, mouth open, arms folded behind the back, the sigil of the womb below. And in its center, the name Maribelle, written not once, but over and over, as though it had been etched in again and again until the threads bled red. The chapel floor was torn up that night. Father Falk oversaw the exhumation of the burial pit beneath. What they found were 11 child-sized coffins, arranged in a spiral. 10 were empty. One contained only a jawbone, small, polished smooth, wrapped in what looked like birthing cloth. But underneath the coffins, stone stairs, descending deep into unlit soil. Maribelle, still strapped in her bed, began convulsing the moment the soil was touched. She whispered, "The throat is dry. The child must speak." And then she laughed. But it wasn't her voice. It was Judith Craze, the nurse who had disappeared weeks earlier. Father Falk, overwhelmed by what he'd seen, vanished the following morning. His journal was recovered in the chapel pew, open to a torn page, reading. The dress was not a map. It was a womb. And the names are contractions. That night, the asylum's chapel burned. Only one thing survived. A slab of stone from beneath the altar, carved with the phrase, "When the 11th speaks, the world will bleed backwards." Like this if you feel something watching. Subscribe to Dead Scroll before the 11th speaks. And comment, "The world will bleed backwards." By the time officials arrived at the asylum, the chapel had been reduced to charred bones and blackened air. Not a single flame remained, but the stones still smoked, not from fire, but from breathing. A breath that reeked of milk, rot, and afterbirth. In the ash, they found the outline of a spiral scorched into the floor. At its center, a tooth. Small, human, infant-like, and it pulsed. The asylum staff were forbidden from speaking of the event. Every record of Maribelle's mother, the staircase, and the child-sized coffins was buried under an official seal labeled inherited psychosis. The world moved on. But one man didn't. Samuel Holt, a gravedigger's apprentice who had watched the burning from the trees, returned to the chapel ruins 3 nights later, driven by something he couldn't name. Not curiosity, not fear, obligation. He walked the spiral barefoot. At every step, the ash rose like fog. And when he reached the center, the tooth disappeared, swallowed into the floor, and the stone shifted. A seam opened where the stairs had once been buried. This time, not steps but a shaft, perfectly round, lined with slick, black root-like tendrils. And from within it a sound, not a hum, not a voice, but the cry of a newborn, repeated every 17 seconds. Samuel descended. Witnesses say he was gone for 3 days. When he returned, he had aged 30 years. His hair white, his hand clawed, his eyes missing. Yet he saw. He wrote compulsively, blind, on the walls of the chapel ruins. Symbols no one understood. Diagrams of mouths inside mouths. Wombs with teeth. Eyes growing on the underside of skin. His final message, scrawled in blood on the stone slab. The throat is real. She is not bound by bone. She will birth herself through the one who remembers. Maribelle stopped breathing that same hour. Doctors declared her dead, but her body never decomposed. And her lips? Still curled into a smile. Because something else had taken her place inside that skin. Like this if you've made it this far alive. Subscribe to Dead Scroll. This is no story. 3 days after Maribelle's declared death, her body was locked inside the moor beneath Daggermoor Asylum. No autopsy, no embalming. Just a corpse strapped to a rusted gurney in a room that stank of chloroform and old teeth. But something was wrong. The temperature wouldn't drop in the morgue. The ice melted in minutes. Flies died if they got too close. And the lights, they never stayed on. One of the night orderlies, a man named Felix Arlott, was sent to investigate a strange smell seeping from under the morgue door. His last words were, "She's not cold." He was found face down in the hallway, his tongue bitten off, his ears folded inside out, and his shoes missing. But the door to the morgue was open, and Maribelle's body was gone. What replaced it was not a body, but a cocoon, woven from what looked like sheared hair, fetal gauze, and strips of human skin, all braided around the gurney like some ritual cradle. Inside, something moved, slowly, deliberately, and it made a noise. Not a cry, but a sucking, wet, rhythmic, hungry. The doctors sealed the room and left it untouched for a week. But at night, they heard the voice. Not Maribelle's, not Judith's, not any single voice. A chorus, low, infantile, whispering in unison from beneath the door. We are her. She remembers. She remembers. Then silence. Until the cocoon tore open on the 8th night. What stepped out was not Maribelle. It wore her face, but wrong. Stretched. Too smooth. As if it had been reprinted from memory, not grown. It didn't walk. It slid, leaving a trail of bloodless liquid. Milky, with flecks of fingernails and teeth. And when it opened its mouth to scream, nothing came out. Because inside its throat was a mirror. And in that mirror, witnesses claimed they saw their own reflection aged, decayed, and smiling. The new Maribelle walked into the chapel ruins alone. And when she reached the center of the spiral, she knelt and began to dig. Like this video if your skin feels wrong. Subscribe to Dead Scroll, or she'll speak your name next. And comment below. She remembers. They say the human body can only dig for so long before it breaks. Joints lock. Fingernails split. Bones crack beneath pressure. But Maribelle didn't break. She dug with hands that didn't bleed. Fingers that moved like roots through soil. Silent. Methodical. As if following a memory stored not in her mind, but in her marrow. Witnesses, mostly asylum staff hiding in the forest's edge, reported that the ground itself seemed to lean inward, the trees bowing toward the spiral like mourners at a cradle. After 6 hours of digging, her hand struck something hard. Stone. No one dared approach, but by dawn, they could see it clearly, a sealed vault. Rough, uneven, covered in glyphs that predated any language known to modern man. One symbol appeared 7 times. A mouth sewn shut with baby's teeth. That morning, 3 patients in the asylum's east wing, all mute, began screaming the same sentence over and over. She has found the mouth beneath. Then silence. Every clock in Daggermoor stopped at 6:17 a.m. The vault opened. Not with noise. Not with dust. It simply was open. Inside was no treasure. No bones. No relics. Just a narrow passage, slick with afterbirth and lined with rows of infant shoes, each pointed inward, as if watching whoever dared enter. And she did. Maribelle, or what now wore her shape, crawled into the dark without hesitation. Without fear. As if returning to where she had always belonged. And from within that passage came a sound that none could ever forget. The wet, labored breath of something too large to be born and too old to die. It whispered, "Her skin is ready." Every mirror in the asylum cracked. Every pregnant woman in Daggermoor miscarried that day. And every child under the age of 10 drew the same shape in the dirt. A woman with no face, holding her own jaw. The doctors tried to seal the vault. They tried praying over it. Tried burning the surrounding ground. But the soil refused fire. Because something had awakened. And it was waiting for skin. Like if your reflection looked at you wrong this morning. Subscribe to Dead Scroll for the next descent. For 30 years, the asylum's foundation stood upon hollow soil. But none of the builders knew it. None of the priests sensed it. None of the doctors believed it. But the land did. It remembered what had been buried beneath the old chapel. Not a vault, not a grave, but a womb, carved from stone and sorrow, meant not to contain a body, but to gestate something older than death. Once Maribelle crawled inside, everything changed. She didn't emerge. She shed. Pieces of her, hair, skin, teeth, surfaced hours later, drifting up from the soil like dandelion seeds, floating through the asylum halls on air that smelled like milk and mold. The orderlies burned them, but the smell never left. Then came the sound. First a low thrum, like something breathing beneath the building. Then came the pulses. Every 7 minutes. The floors swelled. The pipes moaned. And in the infirmary, the walls began to sweat. Not water, but colostrum, the first milk. Nurses reported hearing babies cry. Not from the nursery, but from the drains. From the seams in the walls. From the mouths of patients who had never spoken. Father Callum, the asylum's priest, ventured into the basement chapel to bless the earth. He never returned. Only his robe did, soaked, folded, and hung from the ceiling like a placenta. On it, written in fingernail scratches. Her hunger is not for blood. It is for the unmade. The board tried to shut down the asylum. But any carriage that attempted to leave the valley crashed. Riders broke their legs. Horses turned mad and threw themselves into the marsh. No exit, because the womb was still opening. And from within, something ancient was preparing to be born. It wasn't just Maribelle anymore. She was only the vessel. What stirred beneath Daggermoor was older than the town itself. Older than language. Older than shame. And it needed a name. One that would echo backward through bloodlines. One that would remake all flesh in its image. Like, subscribe to Dead Scroll. Comment below. She is the unmother. The birthing began on the night of the Red Frost. Daggermoor had never seen snow in autumn. Yet on October 3rd, The ground glazed over with a layer of crimson ice, thin as skin, stretching from the chapel ruins to the edge of the forest. The livestock froze in place. Birds fell mid-flight, and in the asylum, the clocks began ticking backward. The staff gathered in the east wing as screams rang out from beneath the floorboards. Wet, animal sounds, like flesh tearing under its own weight. At 3:06 a.m., the stone cracked. From the spiral where Maribelle had vanished, a limb emerged. But it was no child's arm. It was longer than a man's, jointed in the wrong places, skinless, covered in veins that pulsed like heartbeats. At the tip, a hand with 6 fingers, each fused at the base, webbed like an unborn thing. It groped the ground, not blindly, but as if remembering it. Then came a sound, a cry, not from baby, but from the world itself. A groan that made glass shatter across Daggermoor. That drove dogs mad. That forced men to their knees, weeping, even though they didn't know why. One nurse tried to flee. She opened the front door, and outside stood a figure in a blood-soaked nightgown. It was Maribelle, but not. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth sewn shut with strands of her own hair. Her stomach, impossibly distended, pulsing like a second heart. She took one step forward, and the asylum tilted. Every beam creaked. Every window bowed inward. And the whisper returned. The first of the unmothered comes. Within seconds, every light died. When they flickered back, the nursery was empty. No cribs, no children, just a single mark burned into the floor. A spiral wrapped around a womb. What was born that night wasn't meant for this world. It didn't crawl. It didn't walk. It bled backward through time, into names and lineages, reshaping the future by rewriting the past. And its first host would not be a stranger. It would be someone we already knew. Like this video if your dreams have gone quiet lately. Subscribe to Dead Scroll before the lights go out. The unmother did not choose at random. She remembered. She remembered who had looked upon her with doubt. Who whispered prayers when they should have screamed. Who locked the asylum doors when they should have opened the chapel floor. And so, the selection began. It started with the Beechwood family. 6 generations in Daggermoor. Midwives. Baptists. Untouched by scandal. Until now, their lineage vanished in one night. Birth certificates went blank. Graves were found dug open, not disturbed but vacant, as if their ancestors had never existed. Portraits melted from their frames. Even their name faded from the town registry. By sunrise, no one remembered they had ever lived. Except for one man. Dr. Elias Hume, the asylum's former chief surgeon. He woke that morning with dried blood beneath his fingernails and an infant's cry echoing in his ear. When he looked into the mirror, he saw someone else's eyes staring back, gray, lidless, filled with milk. And carved into his shoulder, in perfect circles, was a new mark. She nurses the forgetting. Dr. Hume, once a man of logic and cold science, began scratching at the walls of his quarters with shards of broken glass. Scratching spirals. Thousands of them. He claimed he'd seen the nursery. Not the old one. The new one. The one beneath the chapel. Where the floor was soft as skin, and the cradles were made of bone. Where the lullabies were sung not by mouths, but by the walls themselves. And every crib? Occupied. By infants who had no eyes. Who breathed through their ribs. Who whispered the names of the living. One of those names was yours. Because the unmother wasn't just choosing descendants. She was choosing witnesses. People who would remember her when no one else dared to. People who would carry her spiral in their veins. And when their time came, they'd return to the chapel. And deliver themselves willingly. This isn't a story about Maribelle anymore. This is about what she became. And who you'll become next. Subscribe to Dead Scroll now. Because forgetting is how she wins. Like this video if the mirror feels wrong lately. Doctor. Elias Hume ran barefoot through the snow-draped forest behind Daggermoor Asylum. His hospital gown soaked in milk, blood, and something else. Something that steamed in the cold but refused to freeze. His eyes were wide. Not with madness, but clarity. He knew now. He'd seen her heart. Beneath the ruins of the chapel, past the gnarled wooden altar and the spiral-carved stone, there pulsed a mass of translucent muscle. It beat once every hour. Each time it did, someone in the town forgot a loved one's name. He was next. That night, he carried with him a bundle wrapped in stained linens. Not a journal, not a child, but a preserved organ. Maribelle's tongue. removed and hidden before she entered the chamber. A last attempt to preserve her identity, to shield at least one part of her from the transformation. But the tongue was changing in his hands. It had begun to speak, not with sound but heat. It pulsed when danger approached. It warmed when lies were told. It froze in the presence of the spiral. He followed its signals, through dead forests, across frozen rivers, toward a cave no map marked, a cavity in the mountain, older than any town, any church, any grave. Inside, the walls were alive with movement, mucus slick and trembling. The deeper he went, the more the walls resembled womb lining. Veins beat, fluids dripped, the air stank of afterbirth and secrets. At the center, he found what he never expected. Others, men and women, silent, naked, marked with a spiral, standing in rows, eyes wide, mouths slack, all facing a cradle of stone. And in that cradle, not a child, not a god, but a mirror, one that reflected nothing. He stepped toward it. The tongue in his hand went cold. The reflection began to shimmer, and for a moment, Elias saw himself, but as he might have been, a boy, untouched by medicine, kneeling before Maribelle as she crowned. Then the mirror cracked. The womb screamed, and every figure in that room turned toward him at once. Subscribe to Dead Scroll. Like this video before your own name begins to blur. When a mirror inside the stone cradle shattered, it did not break. It bled. Black ichor spilled across the chamber floor, sizzling like acid on the flesh of the silent figures. But they didn't scream. They bowed. They opened their mouths, letting the liquid pour inside. And as they drank, their bodies began to convulse, not in pain, but in remembrance. They had forgotten who they were, and now they were remembering too much. Dr. Elias Hume stumbled backward. The tongue in his hand twisted violently, lashing against his wrist. The spiral on his shoulder flared like a burn. Then, the floor split. From beneath the womb-like walls, something emerged. It was not a creature. It was a concept given form. Tall, thin, wrapped in tendons that pulsed with stolen memories. Its head was a swollen sack of crying mouths. Its fingers were endless, tapering into needles. And stitched into its chest, like a trapped fetus, was an eye, blinking sideways. The unmother's midwife had arrived, and she had one task, to deliver what had been growing in the dark. Dr. Hume turned to flee, but the walls closed behind him. The chamber had become a stomach, and he, a meal. The tongue in his hand screamed through his skin, melting his palm. His eyes turned black. He fell to his knees. But before the midwife could reach him, the figures surrounding the cradle moved in unison. They each raised their arms and ripped open their throats, forming a perfect circle of blood around the stone. And from that circle, it was born. Not a child, not a god, a spiral, three-dimensional, pulsing, spinning in impossible geometry. Every heartbeat it made changed something in the real world. Streets vanished. Graves emptied. Whole surnames disappeared from Daggermoor's town history. And worst of all, time blinked. For 10 seconds, the sun rose and set 5 times. Children woke screaming, unsure what year it was. Birds dropped from the sky, unable to navigate. The town clock tower bent inward, as if the hours themselves refused to continue. Dr. Hume looked into the spiral and saw his own autopsy. A memory from the future. One that hadn't happened yet, but now would. Subscribe to Dead Scroll before your reflection learns your future. Like this video, the spiral has seen you, and records exist of what happened next. No journals, no witness accounts, no autopsy notes. Only the room, now sealed beneath the mountain, and one final scrap of a medical ledger signed in blood, not ink. It read, "She is born sideways, and she remembers everything." The spiral, still pulsing in impossible motion, began to rise, hovering above the cradle like a halo torn from some ancient god. And from its center, limbs began to extend, twisted, childlike, jointless. The flesh of the thing was translucent, stitched with tiny mouths and silent eyes. It wasn't crying. It wasn't alive. It was echoing. Echoes of births that never happened. Screams of mothers whose children were stolen in the womb. Names of women erased from hospital logs, all whispered from 1,000 infant lips across its body. It was Maribelle, and not Maribelle. She had been transformed. She had been made into something the asylum, could no longer contain. The young mother. The doctors had tried to erase her. The clergy had tried to bind her. But in the end, she did what no other patient in Daggermoor ever had. She remembered. Dr. Hume fell to his knees, not from fear, but recognition. He saw in her what had been stolen from generations of women. Their voices, their pain, their warnings. And in that moment, Maribelle looked at him. Not with hatred, not with rage, with mercy. One of her limbs touched his forehead, and he forgot everything. His name, his profession, his country, but not her. He would carry her memory, alone, lost, mad, but unburdened by the guilt of men. Outside the womb chamber, the mountain began to shake. All across Daggermoor, the spiral etched itself into stone, into skin, into memory. People woke with symbols carved in their palms. Clocks ticked backward, and all the mirrors cracked. One by one, the asylum rooms emptied, not from escape but from reversal. The patients became nurses. The nurses became dust. The walls breathed for one final hour, and then silence. Subscribe to Dead Scroll, because when they forget, we remember. Like this video to mark yourself as a witness. The town of Daggermoor was never built. It was grown, a secret buried in its soil, a design passed down through blood, not blueprint. And at the center of every map, no matter how far back you go, sits the same impossible shape. The spiral. No founding fathers. No charter. No migration record. Just names, repeating like a curse in the archives. Ashby. Lovelace. Harrow. Ellings. And always at the end of every list, Maribelle. Before the asylum, before the first church was laid, there was a structure buried beneath what would become the town square. A temple, not to God, but to the memory of unbirth. A place where those unwanted by the world were taken, rewritten, repurposed, and reborn. The spiral was never a symbol. It was a system. Every 33 years, a child was selected. One born of a woman who should not remember. One marked by birth that science could not explain. And always, always, the child would vanish into the asylum. Only this time, Maribelle did not vanish. She remembered everything. The townspeople had unknowingly participated in a ritual that spanned generations. By ignoring the asylum, by allowing the disappearances, by forgetting the screams from the hills. Their silence fed the spiral. But Maribelle's case broke the cycle. In the weeks that followed her final appearance in the cradle chamber, strange events gripped Daggermoor. The mayor's newborn turned to dust in her crib. The priest of St. Finn's coughed up a tooth that wasn't his. And the town's archivist tried to hang himself from the church bell rope, only to find the rope was made of hair. Each occurrence traced back to one date. August 3rd, 1865. The day Maribelle died. But she didn't die. She became the town's memory. Wherever her name is spoken, the spiral reawakens. And for those who try to bury the truth, they find themselves buried instead. Subscribe to Dead Scroll, because forgetting is exactly what they want. Like this video to make the spiral see you. They said no records remained. But one letter survived. Hidden beneath a floorboard in the east wing of the abandoned asylum, it was found by a surveyor in 1922. The letter was sealed with dried placenta. The writing? Not ink, but blood from 3 different blood types. None of them matched. It was addressed simply to the next one who tries to forget. Inside, a confession, signed only with the letter H. She was never mad. She was never broken. We broke her. We all did. Her case was a mirror. We looked into it and saw the spiral. And we turned away. That's what damned us. Daggermoor was not cursed. It was built for the curse. We harvested the forgotten, until one remembered. The letter ended with a sketch, an anatomical drawing of a fetus, malformed and horrifying. But behind it was a face. Maribelle's, aged but alert, watching, still alive, somewhere. But then came the warning, written in trembling lines along the page's edge. The spiral doesn't end. It just moves on. If you're reading this, it's already in you. Since that discovery, 3 people involved in the asylum's excavation are unaccounted for. The map of Daggermoor has changed, subtly. The cemetery grew by 14 names that were never buried. And anyone who tries to film in the East Wing finds their camera lens cracked from the inside. The spiral lives on, in every forgotten child, in every erased patient, in every town that keeps quiet and keeps building. You've heard Maribelle's case. Now ask yourself, how many more like her are out there? And when the spiral turns toward your name, will you remember or forget? This has been Dead Scroll. Subscribe now, because stories like this will never be allowed on the surface. Like this video to show that you saw her. And in the comments, write the words, "She remembers." Because if enough of us remember, she won't be alone.